Hi friends, welcome back to our e-teaching channel. I'm back with the most interesting stories of Immortals of Meluha by Amish Tripathi, part 1 of Shiva Trilogy. In today's episode, we'll see chapter 12, Journey Through Meluha. And before that, as usual, a short recap of our previous episode. Our chapter 11 was Nilkant Unveiled. In the chapter, we saw Emperor Daksha proudly announced the arrival of their savior, that is Shiva, the Nilkant, to the people of Meluha. And later we saw Bhadra or Veerbhadra and Shiva's tribe also arrived to Devgiri. And in the later part we saw Shiva, Sati, Parvateshwar, Brahaspati, Ayurvati, Kritika, Nandi and Veerbhadra all summoned towards Meluha. And now let's start our chapter 12, Journey Through Meluha. Who was Menu? Asked Shiva. I have heard of him often, referred to as father. The caravan had been travelling for a few days on the broad road from Devgiri to Kotalwar. The central part consisted of a row of 7 carriages identical to the ones used during the trip to Mandar. 5 of them were empty. Shiva, Sati, Brahaspati and Kritika travelled in the second carriage. Parvateshwar was in the 5th along with Ayurvati and his 3 brigadiers. The generals present meant every rule had to be adhered to strictly. Hence, Nandi, whose rank did not allow him to travel in the carriage, was riding a horse with the rest of the cavalry. Veerbhadra had been inducted as a soldier in Nandi's platoon, led by their respective captains. The brigade were in standard forward, rear and side defense formations around the caravan. Both Brahaspati and Sati started answering Shiva simultaneously. Lord Manu was They both stopped talking. After you, please, Brahaspati ji, said Sati. No, said Brahaspati with a warm smile. Why don't you tell him the story? He knew whose voice the Nilkant would prefer. Of course not, Brahaspati ji. How can I supersede you? It would be completely improper. Will somebody answer me, or are you two going to keep up this elaborate protocol forever? Asked Shiva. All right, laughed Brahaspati. Don't turn blue all over now. That is hilarious, Brahaspati, smiled Shiva. Keep this up and you might actually get someone to laugh in 100 years. As Brahaspati and Shiva chortled, Sati was astounded at the inappropriate manner in which the conversation was going on. But if the revered chief scientist seemed comfortable, she would not say anything. And in any case, how could she reprimand Shiva? Her code of honor forbade it. He had saved her life twice. Well, you are right about Lord Manu being the father, said Brahaspati. He is considered the progenitor of our civilization by all the people of India, including Swadweepans, asked Shiva incredulously. Yes, we believe so. In any case, Lord Manu lived more than 8,500 years before the present day. He was apparently a prince from South India, a land way beyond the Narmada River, where the earth ends and the great ocean begins. That land in the Sangam Tamil? Yes, Sangam Tamil was then the richest and the most powerful country in the world. Lord Manu's family, the Pandyas, had ruled that land for many generations. However, from the records left by Lord Manu, we know that by this time the kings had lost their old code of honor, having fallen on corrupt ways. They spent their days in the pleasures of their fabulous wealth rather than being focused on their duties and their spiritual life. Then a terrible calamity occurred. The seas rose and destroyed their entire civilization. My God! Exclaimed Shiva. Lord Manu knew that this day would come and had in fact prepared for it. He believed it was the decadence his old country had fallen into that had incurred the wrath of the gods. Wanting to escape the calamity, he led a band of his followers to the northern higher lands in a fleet of ships. He established his first camp at a place called Mehragar, deep in the western mountains of present-day Meluha. Wanting to establish a moral and just society, he gave up his princely robes and became a priest. In fact, the term for priest in India, Pandit, is a derivation of Lord Manu's family name, Pandya. Interesting. So how did Lord Manu's little band grow into the formidable India we see today? The years immediately following their arrival at Mehragar were harsh on them. With each year's monsoon, the flooding and sea tides would become stronger. But after many years, and with the force of Lord Manu's prayers, the anger of the gods abated and the waters stopped advancing. The sea, however, never receded to its original levels. This means that somewhere in the deep south, the sea still covers the ancient Sangatamal cities. We believe so, answered Brihaspati. Once the sea stopped advancing, Lord Manu and his men came down the mountains. They were shocked to see that the minor stream of Indus had become a massive river. Many other rivulets across northern India too had swollen and 6 great rivers had emerged. Indus, Saraswati, Yamuna, Ganga, Sarayu and Brahmaputra. Lord Manu said the rivers started flowing because the temperatures of our land rose with the wrath of the gods. With the rise in temperatures, huge channels of ice or glaciers frozen high in the Himalayas had started melting, creating the rivers. Villages and later cities grew on the banks of these rivers. Thus, our land of the 7 rivers, Sapta Sindhu, was born out of the destruction of the Sangatamar. 7? But you mentioned the creation of 6 rivers in North India. Yes, that's true. The 7th river already existed. It is the Narmada and it became our southern border. Lord Manu strictly forbade his descendants to go south of the Narmada, and if they did so, they could never return. This is a law that we believe even the Chandravanshis adhere to. So what are Lord Manu's other laws? There are numerous laws actually. They are all listed in an extensive treatise called the Manusmriti. Would you be interested in listening to the entire text? Tempting, smiled Shiva, but I think I'll pass. With your permission, my lords, perhaps we can further discuss Lord Manu's guidance of our society over lunch, suggested Kritika. At a short distance from the road on which the Nilkant's caravan travelled, a small band of about 40 men trudged silently along the Bias. 1 and 2 men of the platoon carried a small coracle on his head. It was typical of this region. The locals made small and light boats made of bamboo, cane and rope, portable enough to be carried by a single man on his head. Each boat ferried 2 people with relative safety and speed. At the head of the platoon was a young man with a proud battle scar adorning his face, his head crowned with a brown turban. A little ahead of him walked a hooded figure. With his head bowed, his eyes scrunched, he took slow, methodical steps, his mind lost in unfathomable thoughts. His breathing was hard. He brought his hand up languidly to rub his masked forehead. There was a leather bracelet on his right wrist with the serpent Om symbol embroidered on it. Vishwadyumna, said the hooded figure, we will enter the river from here. Whenever we come close to the populated areas, we will move away from the river to avoid detection. We have to reach Karachapa within 2 months. Karachapa, my lord? Asked Vishwadyumna, surprised. I was under the impression that we were to have a secret audience with the queen outside Lodha. No, answered the hooded figure. We will meet her outside Karachapa. Yes, my lord, answered Vishwadyumna, as he looked back in the direction of the road to Kotalwar. He knew that his lord would have dearly liked to make one more attempt to kidnap the princess. He also knew that it was foolhardy to endeavor to do so, considering the strength of the force accompanying the caravan. In any case, they were behind schedule for their main mission. They had to meet the queen urgently. Turning towards one of his soldiers, Vishwadyumna ordered, Shrikta, place your coracle in the river and give me your oar. I will row the lord through his part of the journey. Shrikta immediately did as instructed. Vishwadyumna and the hooded figure were the first of the platoon to enter the river. Vishwadyumna had already started rowing as his men started placing their boats into the waters. At a distance further down the river, the hooded figure saw 2 women launching carelessly on a boat. One of the women was sloppily splashing water from the side of the boat onto her friend, who was making a hopeless attempt to get avoided wet. Their childish game caused their boat to sway dangerously from side to side. The hooded figure saw that the woman had not detected a crocodile that had entered the river from the opposite bank. Having spied that what must have looked like an appetizing meal, the crocodile was swimming swiftly towards the woman's boat. Look behind you, shouted the hooded figure to the woman, as he motioned to Vishwadyumna to row rapidly in their direction. The woman could not hear him from the distance. What they did see, however, was 2 men were rowing towards them. They could see one of them was almost a giant covered from head to toe in a strange robe, his face covered with a mask. His man was making frantic gestures. Behind the duo were a large number of soldiers swiftly pushing their boats onto the river. That was all the warning the woman needed, thinking that the men were coming towards them with evil intent. The women put all their effort behind the oar and started hastily rowing away from the hooded figure's boat into the path of the crocodile. No! Shouted the hooded figure. He grabbed the oar from Vishwadyumna, using his powerful arms to row rapidly. He was shortening the distance between them and the 2 men, but not fast enough. The crocodile closed in on the woman's boat and, diving underwater, charged at the craft, rocking it with its massive body. The tiny vessel tilted and capsized, throwing the woman into the Bias. Screams of terror rent the air as the woman fought to stay afloat. The crocodile had moved too far ahead in its dash. Turning around, it swam towards the struggling woman. The delay of those crucial seconds proved fateful for the woman. The rescue boat arrived between the crocodile and them. Turning towards Vishwadyumna, the hooded figure ordered, "Save the woman." Before Vishwadyumna could react, he had flung his robe aside and dived into the river. With his knife held tight between his teeth, he swam towards the advancing crocodile. Vishwadyumna pulled one of the women into the boat. She had already lost consciousness. Turning to the other woman, he reassured, "I'm coming back soon." Vishwadyumna turned and paddled vigorously towards the bank. On the way, he passed some of his other soldiers. Row quickly, the Lord's life is in danger. The other soldiers paddled towards the area where the hooded figure had dived into the water. The water had turned red with blood from the battle raging under the water. The soldiers said a silent prayer to Lord Varun, the god of the water and the seas, hoping that the blood did not belong to their lord. One of the soldiers was about to jump into the water with his sword when the hooded figure emerged onto the surface. Soaked in blood. It was that of the crocodile. He swam forcefully towards the other woman who was on the verge of losing consciousness. Reaching her in the nick of time, he pulled her head out of the water. Meanwhile, two of the Chandravanshi soldiers dived off their coracle. "My lord, please get into the boat," said one of them. "We will swim ashore. Have the woman first," replied the hooded figure. The soldiers pulled the unconscious woman onto the coracle. The hooded figure then carefully climbed aboard and rowed towards the shore. By the time the hooded figure reached the riverbank, the other woman had been revived by Vishwadyumna. She sat disoriented at the rapid chain of events. "Are you all right?" Vishwadyumna asked the woman. In answer, the woman looked beyond Vishwadyumna and screamed. Vishwadyumna turned around. On the riverbank, the hooded figure was coming ashore, carrying the other woman's limp body. His clothes were glued to his massive body to the disoriented woman. The crocodile's blood all over his clothes seemed like that of her friend. "What have you done, you beast?" shrieked the woman. The Naga looked up abruptly. His eyes showed mild surprise. He, however, refrained from saying anything. He gently laid the unconscious woman on the ground. As he did so, the mask on his face came undone. The woman next to Vishwadyumna stared at him with horror. "Naga!" she screeched. Before Vishwadyumna could react, she leapt to her feet and fled screaming, "Help! Help! A Naga is eating my friend!" The Naga looked at the fleeing woman with melancholic eyes. He shut the windows to his tormented soul and shook his head slightly. Vishwadyumna, meanwhile, turned to see his lord's face for the first time in years. He immediately lowered his gaze, but not before he had seen the rare emotion of intense pain and sorrow in his lord's normally expressionless eyes. Seething in anger, Vishwadyumna drew his sword, swearing to slay the ungrateful wench he had just saved. "No, Vishwadyumna," ordered the Naga. Pulling his mask back on, he turned to his other soldiers. "Revive her." "My lord," argued Vishwadyumna, "her friend will bring others here. Let's leave this woman to her fate and go." "No, but my lord, someone may come soon. We must escape." "Not till we have saved her life," said the Naga in his usual calm voice. The royal party, including Nandi and Veerbhadra, were sitting together, enjoying their lunch in the courtyard of the rest house. They had stopped at half the brigade too was eating their meal. They needed all the energy they could gather to march in this scorching heat. Parvateshwar had come in to check on the food arrangements. He was especially concerned about Sati's comfort. However, he had refused to join them. He was going to eat later with his soldiers. A loud commotion from an area of one of the perimeter gods. A loud commotion from the area of one of the perimeter gods disturbed Shiva. He got up to investigate, motioning to Brahaspati, Nandi and Veerbhadra to remain seated. Parvateshwar too had heard the racket and was moving towards the uproar. "Please save her," cried the woman. "A Naga is eating her alive." "I'm sorry," answered the captain, "but we have strict orders. We are not to leave the vicinity of this rest house under any circumstances." "What is the matter?" asked Parvateshwar, turning in surprise. The captain saluted and bowed low. "My lord," said the captain, "this woman alleges that a Naga has attacked her friend. She is asking us to help her." Parvateshwar looked at the woman intensely. He would have liked nothing more than to chase the Naga party and destroy them, but his orders were crystal clear. He was not to leave the Nilkanth and Sati. Their protection was the only objective of the brigade. But he was a Kshatriya. What kind of Kshatriya would he be if he did not fight to protect the weak? Seething at the restrictions forced upon him, Parvateshwar was about to say something when Shiva appeared. "What's the matter?" asked Shiva. "My lord," said the captain in awe. He could not believe that he was actually getting a chance to converse with Nilkanth. "This woman claims that her friend has been attacked by Nagas. We are concerned that it may be a trap. We have heard about the Chandravanshi duplicity on the Mount Mandar road." Shiva heard his inner voice cry, "Go back, help her." Drawing his sword in one smooth motion, he told the woman, "Take me to your friend." Parvateshwar looked at Shiva with respect. It was mild, but it was respect all the same. He immediately drew his sword and turned to the captain. "Follow us with your platoon. Brigadier Rakha, put the entire brigade on alert for any surprise attack. The princess must be kept safe at all costs." Shiva and Parvateshwar ran behind the woman, who seemed to lead them with ease. She was obviously a local. The captain trailed them with his platoon of 30 soldiers. After sprinting for the larger part of an hour, they finally reached the riverside to find a dazed woman sitting on the ground. With heavy breaths, she was staring in shock at an imaginary vision in the distance. There was blood all over her clothes, but strangely no injury to her. There were many footsteps that appeared to be coming out of the river and going back in. The captain looked at the woman who had led them here with suspicious eyes. Turning to his soldiers, he ordered, "Form a perimeter around the general and the Nilkanth. It could be a trap." "She was being eaten alive, I tell you," screeched the woman, absolutely stunned to see her friend alive and unharmed. "No, she was not," said Shiva calmly. He pointed at the corpse of the crocodile floating in the river. A large flock of crows had settled on the carcass, fighting viciously over its entrail. "Somebody just saved her from that crocodile." "Whoever it was has rowed across the river, my lord," said the captain, pointing towards the heavy footmarks close to the river. "Why would a Naga risk his own life to save this woman?" asked Shiva. Parvateshwar seemed as surprised. This was completely unlike the usual bloodthirsty Nagas they had dealt with till now. "My lords," said the captain, addressing both Shiva and Parvateshwar, "the woman appears safe. Perhaps it is not wise for everybody to stay here. If I have your permission, I will escort these women back to their village and rejoin the caravan at Kotalwar. You could retire to the rest house." "All right," said Parvateshwar. "Take 4 soldiers with you just in case." Both Shiva and Parvateshwar walked back, baffled by this bizarre event. It was late in the evening. Shiva, Brahaspati, Nandi, and Veerbhadra sat quietly around the campfire. Shiva turned to see Sati sitting at a distance on the rest house veranda along with Ayurvati and Kritika, having a serious conversation. Parvateshwar, as usual, moved among his soldiers, personally supervising the security arrangements of the camp and the comfort of his boys. It's ready, Shiva, said Veerbhadra, handing over the chillam to the Nilkant. Shiva brought the pipe up to his lips and pulled hard. He relaxed visibly. Feeling the need for a respite, he smoked some more before passing it back to his friend. Veerbhadra offered it to Brahaspati and Nandi, who both declined. Brahaspati stared at Shiva, who kept stealing glances at Sati. He smiled and shook his head. What? Asked Shiva, who had noticed Brahaspati's gesture. I understand your longing, my friend, whispered Brahaspati, but what you are hoping for is quite difficult, almost impossible. When it's so valuable, it can't be easy, can it? Brahaspati smiled and patted Shiva on his hand. Veerbhadra knew what his friend needed, dance and music. It always improved his mood. Don't people sing and dance in this wretched country? Private Veerbhadra, said Nandi, his tone different with a subordinate. Firstly, this country is not wretched. It's the greatest land in the world. Veerbhadra playfully put his hands together in a mock apology. Secondly, continued Nandi, we dance only when an occasion demands it, like the holy festival or a public performance. But the greatest joy of dancing is when you do it for no reason at all. Captain, said Veerbhadra. I agree, said Shiva. Nandi immediately fell silent. Without any warning, Veerbhadra suddenly burst out into one of the folk songs of his region. Shiva smiled at his friend, for Veerbhadra was singing one of his favorites. Continuing to sing, Veerbhadra rose slowly and began dancing to the lilting tune, now accompanied by Shiva. The combination of marijuana and dance immediately changed his mood. Brahaspati stared at Shiva, first in shock and then with pleasure. He noticed a pattern in their dancing, a smooth six-step combination repeated rhythmically. Shiva reached out and pulled Brahaspati and Nandi to their feet. They joined in, tentative at first, but it was only a matter of time before a reluctant Brahaspati was dancing with abandon. The group moved together in a circle around the fire, the singing louder and livelier. Shiva suddenly darted out of the rings towards Sati. Dance with me. A flabbergasted Sati shook her head. Oh, come on. If you can dance while you're Guruji and I watch, why not here? That was for knowledge, said Sati. So, is it wrong if we are not dancing for knowledge? I didn't say that. Fine, have it your way, said Shiva with a frustrated gesture. Ayurvati, come. A startled Ayurvati did not know how to react. Before she could decide on a course of action, Shiva held her hand and pulled her into the circle. Veerbhadra lured Kritika in as well. The group danced boisterously and sang loudly, making a racket in an otherwise quiet night. Sati got up, clearly agitated, glad at Shiva's back, and ran into the rest house. Shiva's anger rose even higher as he noticed her absence when he turned towards the veranda. Damn! He got back to his dance, his heart in a strange mixture of pain and joy. He turned once again towards the veranda. There was nobody. Who's behind that curtain? Shiva was dragged into the next move by Veerbhadra. It was a few moments later that Shiva was in a position to look again at the veranda. He could see Sati outlined behind the curtain, staring at him, only at him. Wow! A surprised and delighted Shiva swung back into his dance, moving in his prime form. He had to impress her. Om Namah Shivaya. Do subscribe to our e-teaching channel for further interesting videos and audio books. Give us a thumbs up if you like our videos and share with your friends and family. Comment us to improve our work better. Thank you.